The idea of Antojitos Martin goes back to a family tradition of ours. My mom always had cravings for things like fresas con crema or tamales. Well, really, we all did. But we'd have to go all the way across town. So it was always two stops in different areas to get both, really good, authentic Mexican food and then some of our antojitos, as we call them. And so when we opened up our bar and grill location and we started to see some early success, we thought, wow, what a great idea it would be to have a place right next door where families can come out, they can enjoy a good meal with their family, and then just walk over and get some of the treats that we like, raspados, fresas con crema, bionicos, ice cream, and all that good stuff. We picked the city of Inglewood because our roots are here. We've grown up in this city. We have all of our businesses in the city. Our kids go to school in the cities. So to us, it's very important to stay in the community that we live in and do business in. So it was a no-brainer to bring something different to the city of Inglewood. We feel that there's a lot of cities that have many juice bars, that have many healthy options. And Inglewood was a little bit empty of that. We wanted to fill a void that we saw in the city, which is people were hungry for healthy options, and we're happy to deliver that for them. So we're in business with our parents. They're involved in our day-to-day operations. The things that our parents have always taught us is to stay grounded, right? If you're gonna own a business, you gotta be willing to do everything. If you open up a restaurant, like in our business, you gotta be willing to jump in the kitchen, you gotta bust tables, you gotta greet people, you gotta answer the phone, you gotta go to meetings, you have to do everything. I'd say the biggest challenge for starting a business is really getting started. The first thing you gotta do is be very patient as you go about your journey as an entrepreneur. You have to learn to adapt as your day goes on. Planning is great, and I think everybody does their best to try to plan for their day, but any entrepreneur will know that that can be turned around in a second. I believe it's important for Latinos to start business because, specifically in our culture, hard work is embedded in what we do, and we got a lot of creative ideas. We are blessed to see two different cultures. We're very blessed to be able to see the world through two different lenses, and so that sparks a lot of ideas. It sparks a lot of innovation. So I feel that Latinos in business are very impactful for that reason. I think that the future holds a lot of exciting things for the Martin family. I'm very proud of the fact that despite the growth and despite some of the challenges that we face, like not being able to be around each other all the time, we continue to stay a very close family. So the business and its success is one thing, but the most important thing to me, and one of the things that I'm most proud of, is the fact that despite all of this busyness, if you will, our family continues to stay very, very close, and we love every moment of that.